This lecture will focus on the integumentary system. That is obviously our primary defense system to the outside world. So let's dig right in. The skin is the largest organ in the body. It's vast and huge compared to the rest of the organs that we have. Now, some textbooks do refer to the integument as the cutaneous membrane. You will find this very frequent in anatomy, that there are structures with multiple different names. I will call it either the skin or the integument. I will never refer to it as the cutaneous membrane. The integumentary system consists of the skin and all of its derivatives. So here we're talking about the nails, hair, sweat glands, as well as sebaceous glands. These are all derivatives of the integument. Now, there's quite a list of functions for the integument, and all of these are incredibly important. And it's pretty impressive how much the integument actually does for us. First and foremost, it provides our initial protection. It is our primary source, or primary front of protection to the outside world. So it's that primary barrier to the outside world. It's there to protect us from things like infection, right? Which ties a great deal into this immune defense concept, right? It's there to protect us from water loss, right? So it's protective in the sense that it helps us prevent water loss. It's also there to help protect us from physical damage, so cuts, abrasions, things like that. Right? Prevention of water loss, obviously, it's there to help keep us from dehydrating so rapidly that we would not be able to counteract it. Temperature regulation plays a big role in temperature regulation, both from the sweating perspective as well as vasodilation, vasoconstriction, so increasing or decreasing the width of our blood vessels to allow more or less blood flow through. Allowing more blood flow through allows us to cool faster. Allowing less blood flow through allows us to stay warm longer and shunt most of that blood internally. Immune defense, obviously, this is a big one. The skin provides that primary layer of defense or primary barrier of defense towards infection. It also, interestingly enough, also cultivates quite its own microbiome. So that is a whole ecosystem, so to speak, of bacteria just that are colonized our skin, who keep harmful bacteria from being able to colonize our skin. So we're, in one hand, we are preventing bacteria from growing very easily at all. On the other hand, we're allowing good bacteria, so to speak, to colonize our skin to ward off the bad bacteria. Sensory reception, this is a big one. Obviously, most of our experience with the world, to a large extent, is actually perceived and felt through the skin. So that's a big aspect of things right there. Pain, pleasure, various senses are all perceived through the skin. Excretion, we excrete a lot of things through the skin. We excrete salts and wastes and water and whatnot through the skin. That's also a big role. And the last is interestingly enough, vitamin D formation. So getting skin or sun exposure to our skin on a daily basis allows us to continually make vitamin D, which is necessary for healthy bone growth as well as a lot of other vital functions. Now, the integumentary system is a mixture of many different tissue types. So it's not just a single tissue, but it's a lot of them. There are connective tissues in here that help to provide insulation as well as strength and resilience for the skin. So they allow the skin to be elastic and be pulled without tearing. They also contain a great deal of blood vessels there in those connective tissues. Smooth muscle is going to be there to help control blood vessel diameter as well as hair position. And by hair position, I'm talking about the actual hair shafts that we see along our skin. We'll talk more about that here in a bit. And then we've got a variety of neural tissue in here, obviously, that helps us to monitor receptors on our skin, which allows us to take in sensory information. That allows our brain to make good decisions. If you want to make good decisions about how to respond to the environment, you have to bring in data about the environment. And so that's what the sensory receptors allow us to do. Now, in composition of the skin, we have three major layers, and I'm going to use my mouse here to help us kind of see those. We have the epidermis, which runs from the outermost layer, the superficial most layer of the integument, all the way to this layer here. We see this kind of purple, almost roller coaster like hills and valleys. That is the integument, that is the epidermis, right? And this can be thick or thin. It depends entirely on where we find that. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. The next deep layer to the epidermis is the dermis, and that runs from here to here. Now we have two different layers of this. We have the papillary layer. That is a relatively shallow layer here where we see most of these hills and valleys here within the actual dermis. Right? So these are where a great deal of our what we call dermal papillae arise from. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit. And then from here to here is the reticular layer. We see a great deal of other structures found in the reticular layer. We're going to come back and talk about those. Finally, from the ending of the dermis all the way to the ending of the integument altogether, that deepest layer of the integument is called either the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis. Now, I often refer to this as the hypodermis. I think that's the most obvious, but other books will refer to it as subcutaneous as well. The hypodermis has a great deal of fat and cushion in it, so we're going to talk a bit about the relative importance that plays as well. Now, let's first break down that superficial most layer of the integument. This is the epidermis. It is formed by stratified squamous epithelium, so that is the type of tissue that actually composes the epidermis, stratified squamous. You'll have learned about that in lab. We've got 5 layers here: the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the granulosum, the spinosum, and then finally the basale. And these are in order from superficial to deep. And so these are important. You do want to make sure that you know these 5 cellular layers. And you also want to know where they're present and absent and where they're thicker and thinner. This matters, right? Now, cell types here. There are a lot of different cells that are found in the epidermis. We're going to highlight a few just to kind of give us some understanding of how diverse this actual tissue is. We've got keratinocytes in here. These are mature cells. These are highly keratinized cells. We're going to see most of these here in the stratum corneum, which is our superficial most layer. These are highly keratinized. That means they're highly hardened by proteins called keratin, and they're meant to be that physical barrier to the outside world. Now we've got melanocytes. Melanocytes are there to produce melanin, right? Melanin is that pigment of the skin. So if you've gotten tanner through sun exposure, that is due to the melanocytes producing melanin, which is increasing the pigment of your skin. The Merkel cells. These are sensation-based cells, right? These help bring in sensory information and be able to allow us to perceive a variety of different senses through the skin. The Langerhans cells, these are phagocytic cells. These allow for cleanup of debris. So that is cellular debris, damaged cells that are our cells, or the cleanup of bacterial cells within the actual epidermis. Now we've got thick skin and thin skin. Thick skin is found on these 3 places here, and these kind of start to make sense when you really start to think about them. The palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and then finally our finger and toe pads. These are places on our body where we expect to have the highest exposure, the highest contact with foreign surfaces. We're going to touch a lot of things with these, and thus we expect this skin should be more durable. Now, thick skin is going to have all 5 layers that I talked about already: the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and then finally the deepest layer is that stratum basale. Now, you should know the order and you should know what layers are found in thick skin. Thin skin is the majority of our body. So imagine for a moment, like when you get in the shower, and if the water's too hot, you might not have felt that on your hand when you put your hand in there to feel the water temperature. But the second you get in and it hits your back or it hits your chest, and it's either really cold or very hot, you really sense it there. That's because thin skin is, by definition, thinner. That stratum corneum is going to be much thinner here in the thin skin, and the stratum lucidum is not there at all. So thin skin only has 4 layers. It has got a thinner corneum, it's got the granulosum, the spinosum, and the basale, and the lucidum is not present. Skin color is produced with a lot of different contributing factors. You've got hemoglobin, right? So hemoglobin functions to a point as a pigment within blood, right? So whether or not it is actually bound to oxygen is going to change the color of that blood, and thereby it will change the color of your skin relative to it. Now, melanin also plays a role. Obviously, melanin is a big contributor to skin color, right? Melanin is a pigment that's produced by those melanocytes. And melanin, to a great degree, is genetically determined. So it is determined how much basal melanin our melanocytes produce. So our skin may be generally darker or lighter relative to other individuals without having any additional influence to the sun. And it may get darker as a result of being influenced by UV radiation. So if you're out in the sun, your skin may actually increase in darkness. So that is, it might actually get darker because the melanocytes are producing even more melanin to protect your skin cells from that UV radiation. Now, colors of skin can vary from yellow to reddish to tan to brown to black. I would be much more in the less tan and much more pasty white skin color range, which is not included on here, but we see colors ranging from anywhere within this spectrum. Also, carotene, which comes primarily from the diet, also does help to contribute to skin color overall. Now, epidermal ridges. These are ridges on our skin. They feel like they feel like ridges. They also feel like they feel texture. They give our skin some texture, and these are referred to as the dermal papillae. The dermal papillae, that is within the dermis itself, actually give rise to these epidermal ridges, and we often refer to these as kind of as our palm prints or our fingerprints, right? These are the places where they are most identifiable, they're most dramatic. Now, they are genetically determined, but with some environmental influence. So let me explain that. So that is, your epidermal ridges have a large influence from genetics, but it is not all genetics that make them the way they are. For example, identical twins, for which have identical DNA, do not have identical epidermal ridges or fingerprints. And this identifies a great deal of that environmental influence. You've got identical twins, obviously born by the same parents, who have identical DNA, which gets rid of the variation in genetics. And thus, or despite the fact that they are born from the same parents and have the exact same DNA, their fingerprints are different. And that is because of environmental factors that occur in utero that actually change one sibling's fingerprints from the others. So there's a great deal of environmental influence here as well. Now, they're formed by large folds and valleys that we see both in the dermis as well as the epidermis. They provide friction. They allow us to grasp objects and to grasp onto objects. And these things form very early on in fetal development. At least they begin to form very early on in fetal development. The dermis has two layers. We talked about these a bit already, but now we're going to break down exactly what's in them. The papillary layer of the dermis is largely loose connective tissue, sometimes otherwise termed areolar connective tissue. This is a loose, less dense, less fibrous connective tissue. Here we're going to see a lot more capillaries and nerves, so very small blood vessels and then nerve endings. Very common here in the epidermis. I'm not epidermis, but the skin. The reticular layer. Now this is going to be much more dense, much more packed in. Dense irregular connective tissue is the governing tissue within this layer. Lots of fibers here we see. Blood vessels, right, are also going to be found here. Larger blood vessels because we're getting deeper in the integument. We're also going to find the sweat and sebaceous glands here as well. Finally, we also see hair follicles, nail roots, and lots of sensory nerve endings included within the dermis as well. Now, we should expect that there's going to be a great deal of innervation and blood supply within the dermis. For those of us that have ever gotten a cut, you bleed, right? That's very common. So you'd expect to have blood supply in there in a good amount. But also, we always feel those cuts, even paper cuts. Paper cuts are some of the worst, right? There's a great deal of innervation there. Now, the innervation allows us to differentiate from different kinds of sensory signals from these receptors. And so, obviously, again, I'm going to come back to this, and I can't state this enough. We experience so much of our firsts and some important stimuli straight through our skin. It's such a huge way in which we receive the world and we perceive the world through our touch and how it affects us. And so that innervation is vital in our understanding of the world and how we perceive it and how we react to it. Now, this innervation is going to be found both in the dermis and the epidermis. And that innervation, in part, does also allow us to control blood flow rate because the brain is going to be a part of telling us how big those vessels should be so that we know to cut off blood or increase blood supply to a given area. It's also going to help us to control gland secretion rates, so oil secretion as well as sweat secretion. In the hypodermis, we have a couple of different tissues. We've got the adipose tissue, which is the yellow bubbles, or the tissue that looks like a lot of yellow bubbles here. That is fat, otherwise known as adipose tissue. We were going to have that in the hypodermis. We need to have this in the hypodermis. This provides us a great deal of cushion. And the areolar connective tissue is the pink in between. We see that areolar connective tissue here and here, here, and here. This is that loose connective tissue. This provides us with a great deal of cushion as well. Too far. Sorry about that. The adipose also does provide insulation here, so it allows us to maintain how our internal body temperature, our core body temperature, through this fat within our hypodermis. It's loose. It's a bit more, I don't want to say airy, but it's more loose. It's more accommodating of larger structures, and therefore larger blood vessels are going to be found here. Finally, one of the biggest things about the hypodermis and I like to joke about this because it is important, is how crucial a role it plays in stabilizing our integument's position relative to underlying tissues. That sounds very complicated, but let me make this a lot more simplistic. How many of us have fallen asleep on a couch? Right? You fall asleep on a couch and you wake up and maybe your face was kind of, smashed out of position because you were laying in a weird position, or you were laying on a rough textured couch. And it's not like you wake up and your face is smashed and out of order and you have to like reframe or reform your face now, right? It helps to stabilize that skin so that way, regardless of what you're sleeping on or whatnot, your skin stays in the same relative place, right? And it helps to stabilize, in addition to that cushion as well, its elasticity so that it will indeed kind of bounce back from that texture. I'm sure we've all woken up with that weird kind of texture face where we wake up and we're laying on a weird textured fabric and our face for the briefest of moments has that same texture. The nails are scale-like modifications of the epidermis. They are formed by the stratum corneum, so they're formed by this layer right here. And they are composed of the same keratinized stratified squamous epithelium that we find here in the stratum corneum. So it's going to produce, that stratum corneum is going to produce these nails. And these nails are there to protect the exposed distal tips of our fingers, right? So thereby they prevent damage to the tips of our fingers, or distortion of our fingers due to pressing hard on the structure or perhaps shutting it in a structure. Those nails ultimately end up being a huge protective device for our fingertips. Hair is nearly ubiquitous on the body. It's found throughout the actual body. It is not found on the, and I love this, I apologize because I continually forget to change this. That's supposed to say soles of the feet because you should not have palms on your feet. It is not found on the soles of your feet, despite the fact that it is nearly ubiquitous on the body. These are places it's not found. I think I can speak for the rest of us that it's good that it is not on the soles of our feet. It's also good that it's not on the soles, or sorry, the palms of our hands, right? That would be bad. I think even weirder to think about what it would be having hair on our lips, which thankfully it is not. So there's no hair on our lips, and that's a really great thing in my perspective. Um, it is not on the sides of fingers or toes. And finally, it is not found on portions of our external genitalia. Again, this is a very useful and beneficial thing for a variety of reasons. This hair is going to extend deep into the actual dermis. So it's got a pretty solid anchor there, relatively deep into our integument. Hair functions, about three of these make sense. I think we've all had some kind of experience with these in relationship to our hair. It provides protection. It provides heat retention. It provides sensory reception for those of us with siblings. I'm sure that if you were the older sibling, you have messed with one of your younger siblings by just twitching the hairs on the back of their neck, and they slap or itch the back of their neck, or same thing with the hair on their arm. You can definitely feel a great deal through your hair. Those three, I think, make sense. Protection, heat retention, sensory reception. I think these are all very sensible, very, I don't want to say obvious functions, but about as obvious as they get. The last one I would say is arguably the least obvious to most people, and that is chemical signal dispersal. And it's hard to make this an extremely detailed answer, but I rather want to give you the sense of things, right? So imagine for a moment somebody that you were attracted to, right? I imagine most of us have had that experience where we're attracted to another person, and sometimes we can't actually define why it is that we're attracted to that person. There might be some things that we can point to, but sometimes those few things that we're attracted to don't really add up to the level of attraction that we find ourselves to that person, which means that a lot of this is sort of indescribable. There's an indescribable attraction to another person. And interestingly enough, a great deal of that comes down to things called pheromones, these chemical signal dispersers, that for lack of a better way to describe it, some people just smell good. They just smell good to you. And it's not so much their hygiene that you're smelling, but rather their pheromones. They are attractive to you because their pheromones are attractive to you. And there is so much here that we can talk about. I'm going to give you an example because I think it's a really good, useful example. It helps drive home this idea of chemical signals and their importance. But there was a study done. This is a very creative, well set up study. I would have never thought to do the study the way it was done, but it was eloquently simplistic. And that's, I think, really the key. So they gave a group of young men a white shirt to wear every night for 2 nights while they slept, right? So not during the day when they were doing their regular work tasks or school tasks or whatever tasks they were doing. These were adult men, but they slept only in these white shirts. And these white shirts were kind of a single size. They gave everybody the same size and they slept in this shirt. And then in addition to that, they took a genetic sample from each male and they tested that male for their genes, for their immune genes. And they wanted to look and see what that male's innate immune profile was. So what was their sort of innate or genetic immune profile like? Now, they did this. They gave these shirts to men. They collected them, and then they gave them to women. They gave all the shirts to each woman, and they literally had women go through and smell each shirt. So they'd seal it in a bag, right? The researchers sealed these shirts in a bag, and the women would just open the bag. They'd smell the shirt, and then they would literally, based on that alone, rank how attractive they were to the male that wore that shirt, without ever seeing the male. This sounds like a ridiculous concept, and yet women clearly had a preference here. Women found some shirts, that is, some of the men wearing those shirts, more attractive than other individuals. They also took a genetic sample of the women as well, and they did the same immune profile, so looking at the same immune genes. And what they found overwhelmingly was that women were overwhelmingly attracted to males that had a very different immune profile than their own. In essence, what this very much pointed to was the fact that women were most attracted to men that would provide, for which, if they had children, would provide their children with very broad immune profiles rather than having very limited profiles. Women were not attracted to men that had similar immune profiles to themselves because that would not provide their children with any greater immunity than the women could themselves, but rather they were more attracted to men with very different immune profiles. So we can see how this chemical signal can really make a big difference and help to explain just a little bit of this. Why am I so attracted to this person? And I can't really pinpoint why. Now, there are 3 types of hair that we find on the body. Lanugo hair. This one is not common in adults. This is fetus hair or fetal hair, but it's very fine, very unpigmented hair. And we think of this in like a newborn. Like for those of you that have ever held a newborn, this is a fresh, brand new human being. So it doesn't get any brand new than this. And they have this very fine, very soft, velvety, unpigmented hair, and that is the essence of lanugo hair. Now, vellus hair, this is very common hair. It's found throughout the legs and arms of the body. I shouldn't say legs and hair, but legs and arms of the body. It's fine. It's lightly pigmented. Again, what we'd expect to see on our arms and legs. And then we have terminal hair. This is coarse, very pigmented, so strongly pigmented, and typically longer. Not always very long, but longer. We find this most commonly on our scalp, so that is on the top of our heads, as well as our eyebrows and eyelashes. At puberty, terminal hair replaces vellus hair in some of the axillary and pubic regions, as well as on the faces of men. So we expect to see basically pubic hair turn from vellus hair to terminal hair. And same thing with armpit hair will turn much more into terminal hair. And then for males, obviously that hair on our our face, this is a much more terminal hair, much more coarse, much more pigmented. Hair color, hair loss is attributed to a multitude of different factors, right? Hair color itself results a great deal of the synthesis of melanin in the matrix within the papillae. Variations in hair color reflect both genetically determined differences in the structure of melanin, as well as some environmental factors as well. I think one of those easy environmental factors is the idea that you go outside on a sunny over the course of a summer, right? If you spend a lot of time outdoors, you typically tend to lighten your hair color by being outside and it getting bleached from the UV. So there's a good example of an environmental factor. Another great example of an environmental factor is things like stress and how you live your life. These things can make a great difference on your hair color, and we can see that in related siblings where one might take very good care of themselves and the other takes less than good care of their body. And over time, we can see differences in that person's skin and their hair color as the result of the way they live their lives. Hormones and age also affect hair, right? They're obviously going to play a role. Now we've got exocrine glands in the skin, and these are glands that are going to dump their products directly onto a surface. So that's why we're referring back to these. Sweat glands, another term for sweat glands is sudoriferous. Almost no student refers to these as sudoriferous. Sweat glands, again, these are going to be watery secretions. They're produced by either merocrine or apocrine sweat glands. Merocrine sweat glands are found on the palms of your hands, soles of your feet. They're very clear secretions. Apocrine sweat glands, typically more common in the axillary and groin regions. Much more of a viscous, somewhat thicker sweat relative to merocrine secretions. Sebaceous glands, again, this is oil secretions. These are the oily secretions that coat our hair shafts and our epidermal surface, act as a lubricant, act as a anti-dehydration. Allows our skin to maintain its flexibility, its pliability, its resilience from this lubricant. We do have other unique glands that are associated with our integument. The ceruminous glands are found in our ear canals, our external ear canals, and these produce cerumen, otherwise known as earwax. Mammary glands are, interestingly enough, modified apocrine sweat glands. These produce breast milk and are found exclusively on the breasts. Now, are they found on females' breasts or males' breasts? Interestingly, both. Both males and females do have mammary glands. Typically, only women will actually lactate. But every once in a while, so will a particular male. It seems to be relatively uncommon in men, but a small percentage of men will also lactate and can also lactate. It's kind of a unique, probably a relatively awkward thing for the male involved, but nonetheless, we see these structures in both males and females. Now the integument ages, and as it ages, its show of age is dictated by so many different things. Skin repair process, basically everything with the skin gets worse with age. Period. And that's typical, right? Our bodies are less able to do everything it used to do when we were younger as we age. Skin repair is no exception to this rule. Skin repair takes far longer to process relative to people that are younger. And this is due to the reduced number and activity of stem cells within the skin. Skin forms wrinkles and becomes less resilient as we age. And this is a common thing. We tend to see more wrinkles in older individuals than we do in younger individuals. Skin's immune responsiveness is diminished. So the immunity within our actual skin gets far lower as we age. Our skin becomes drier due to decreased sebaceous gland activity. We see altered skin and hair pigmentation. For those of you that have a living grandparent, I imagine if you looked at your grandparent's skin, it looks far more, I don't want to say transparent, but it's definitely more see through than a much younger person. Their hair has a vastly different hair pigmentation than when they were of a different age, when they were younger. Sweat production diminishes. We see blood supply decreases, and thus we have impaired thermoregulation as we grow older. Hair tends to thin and loss begins here as age goes on. The production of vitamin D3 within the skin also diminishes. And then finally, we see the development of certain skin cancers are more prevalent, more common, more severe as we get older. This slide is not going to be on the exam, but I like to point it out just so that most people have an idea of what kind of skin cancers are most prevalent and what are the greatest factors involved here. Usually, this is much more of a kind of a public service announcement than anything else. Most common types of skin cancer found are basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and finally malignant melanoma. These are the three most common skin cancers. Single greatest risk factor is exposure to UV, specifically too much UV radiation. That is why sunscreen can be such an incredibly important thing in warding off skin cancer. Now, interestingly enough, and this is something my parents did not understand when I was younger, but the highest incidence of skin cancer in older people are those that had severe sunburns, especially as children. So, for your kids, if you have kids or you have younger brothers and sisters or whatnot, it is imperative to them that they wear sunscreen, much more so than my parents ever thought. My parents used to think that because I was young, I could handle everything better. And that's not really the case. The younger we are, the more damage our skin can take on. And that damage can then pervade later on to life in skin cancer. So that is, kids that had severe sunburns are more likely to have skin cancer uh, as they get older. So just something to keep in mind. We often think of kids as having this kind of very resilient body, and they do very much. They heal very quickly, but that does not shield them from the risk of skin cancer. It only makes their risk a little bit higher.